The rain had long stopped, yet the city still shimmered as if freshly polished. From the large glass window of the small theater on Mission Street, San Francisco cast a soft mist over the streetlights, wrapping everything in a gentle halo. Inside, the auditorium of the Bay Area Youth Talent Show buzzed with the sounds of shuffling chairs, children's whispers, and the nervous murmurs of parents. Evan Cole sat in the front row reserved for sponsors. His tie loosened a notch. He glanced at his watch. 9:27. His schedule for tomorrow was packed, and he had planned to leave after the previous act. Aurora Sound Systems was launching a new product next week. He wasn't the type to linger at events filled with applause but lacking in data. But then the host spoke, and a little girl with soft brown hair stepped out, her ballet shoes touching the stage lights like whispers. "Hello?" She spoke into the microphone, her voice trembling yet clear. "My name is Sophie Morgan. This song is for my mom. She said her heart gets tired sometimes, so tonight I'll sing to let her heart rest." The room fell still. Evan lifted his head. That sentence, simple, unadorned, struck something very old inside him. And for a brief second, he noticed the girl's hazel eyes, so much like a pair he'd spent years avoiding in memory. Sophie lowered the mic slightly, took a deep breath, then touched the keys of the electric piano placed before her. The first two notes drifted out, thin as mist. At the third note, Evan felt his stomach tighten. That melody, impossible to mistake. A tune he had once scribbled in pencil on a napkin in a Bayside bar 9 years ago. On a windless night when he was still poor, and love still felt like something that could last. "You are my home when the world feels lost." That small voice bloomed beneath the theater's dome, pure and controlled in a way uncanny for an 8-year-old. She wasn't showing off. She simply stood there, feet steady, shoulders straight, chin tilted at that familiar angle, the very tilt Leela used to have when she reached the high notes. Evan stopped checking his phone. He saw again the long nights on a wooden floor, the smell of old coffee, the laughter of a girl holding a worn guitar. He saw the broken music box that could only play 3 notes before dying, the same 3 notes Sophie had just played. His fingers clenched the armrest until his knuckles turned white. "No way," reason whispered. But his heart, the disciplined part of him, stirred in rebellion. Every note, every breath, every tiny tremor in her voice pulled at the veins of memory. When Sophie leaned into the final high note, her chin tilted a bit more, eyes half closed as if listening to a sound from far beyond the stage. Exactly like that. Precisely like that. For a fleeting moment, he saw again the tiny ring still locked in his office safe, the one he'd never had the chance to give. The short letter left, behind years ago, hastily written, "I can't love a liar." Then, blank, hollow. As the song swelled into its chorus, the room grew so silent he could hear his own breathing. Evan didn't stand. He couldn't. Something held him there. A thread both fragile and unbreakable. A faint, dangerous knowing. The song ended like a whispered prayer. "You are my home." Small hands left the keys. Silence. Then an eruption of applause, roaring like waves. Sophie bowed, cheeks flushed with excitement. She waved toward the wings, where a woman stood pressed against the wall, one hand on her chest, as if holding her heartbeat still. It lasted only a second, but long enough for Evan to see the familiar lines of that smile, that gaze following the child. The world inside him froze. No, it couldn't be coincidence. His phone buzzed nonstop. Emails, meeting alerts, acoustic test reports. He silenced it. For the first time in months, the numbers no longer mattered. As the applause faded, Sophie returned to the mic, her voice still trembling but warm. "Thank you, everyone. I want to dedicate this song to my mom. She says music is her home. If she feels a little better tonight, then I guess I did it right. Soft laughter rippled through the room, tender as breath. Evan felt the sting in his eyes. He swallowed, standing slowly. No one noticed. Everyone was still clapping for the little girl, but for him, each step away from the VIP row felt like leaving familiar sand to wade into dark water, toward something waiting. In the backstage corridor, pale neon light fell across the concrete floor. He stopped, hand pressed to his chest as if to locate his heartbeat. For 9 years, he'd trained himself to be silent about the past. But just 3 notes had torn the door wide open. Lila. The name rose unbidden in his mind. And then, as if it were the only logical next step, he pulled out his phone, opening his company's secure contact list. "Margot," he said when the line picked up. His voice was low and steady, like when he signed crucial deals. "I need something. Tonight. Find me everything you can about Sophie Morgan and her mother." On stage, music moved on to the next act. For him, an old chapter had quietly closed, and somewhere amid the lights and mist of San Francisco, an old melody was leading him home. That night, after leaving the theater, Evan couldn't shake the tiny melody from his mind. "You are my home when the world feels lost." 9 years. He hadn't heard anyone sing that song in 9 years, and that child, her eyes, her tilted head, looked so heartbreakingly like Lila. He had met her for the first time in a small seaside bar in Santa Cruz. She sang sad ballads with a crystal-clear voice, smiling as if nothing in the world could ever frighten her. Evan, then just a young sound engineer, had secretly recorded her chorus and said, "The bridge is missing 2 beats. If you add them, it'll feel complete." She laughed. "Then why don't you try writing it?" They wrote together until morning. From then on, music tied them together like 2 unfinished halves. They rented a tiny apartment, lived on instant coffee, canned noodles, and half-finished demo tapes, but their love was full. When Aurora Sound began attracting investors, Evan threw himself into work. He believed that in just a few years, he would finally be able to give her everything she deserved. But one day, he left for a conference in Seattle. When he came back, the apartment was empty. On the table lay a folded piece of paper. "I can't love a liar." No explanation, no message, no trace. Lila had vanished as if she had never existed. He hired people to search, but no one knew. Until tonight, her name had returned, carried by the voice of an 8-year-old child. The next morning, Evan received a report from his assistant. "Sophie Morgan, 8 years old. Mother, Lila Morgan. Works at Sweet Laurel Bakery. Heart condition, under treatment at San Francisco General Hospital." He read the words, "heart condition," over and over. Something tightened in his chest. How had she lived all these years? At noon, he stood outside the bakery. Through the frosted glass, Lila was wiping the counter. Her hair was shorter, her frame thinner, but her eyes were still gentle. She smiled at customers, one hand pressed lightly to her chest, as if to steady her heartbeat. He couldn't bring himself to go in. He just stood there, heart tangled like a bundle of audio cables knotted on an old work table. When she looked up, their eyes met. For a single second. Then she froze and dropped the pastry tongs she was holding. Evan stepped back on instinct. He wasn't ready. Between them lay 9 years of silence and a child. He hurried to his car, pulling out his phone as he walked. His voice was rough, low. "Margot, I need the next appointment for Lila Morgan at San Francisco General Hospital. Please find it immediately." A few minutes later, the phone buzzed. The assistant's message was brief. "Thursday, 10 a.m., Cardiology Department, 5th floor." Evan sat quietly for a long time, watching the screen light up and fade. Then he whispered under his breath, "Not yet, but I'll be there." That night, driving home, he played an old recording, the one they'd once sung together. Lila's voice filled the car speakers, bright and full of faith. Through the noise and the rain, I'll find my way home to you. He closed his eyes. Back then, it had been a promise. Now, it was a compass. And this time, he swore he would not let it slip away. Thursday morning. A thin veil of fog covered San Francisco, the pale sunlight filtering weakly through the glass windows of San Francisco General Hospital. Evan parked his car at the entrance, took a deep breath, and stepped into the main lobby. He had never imagined his hands would tremble this much, just walking into a hospital. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the sound of shoes clicking on the floor, voices calling out patient names. Everything moved with the steady rhythm of a place that lived every day between life and death. He approached the reception desk, introduced himself briefly, and was directed to the 5th floor. The higher he went, the drier his throat became. Every step seemed to pull behind it 9 years of regret. At the end of the corridor, the door to the cardiology clinic stood half open. Lila stepped out, holding a folder in her hand. She wore a light coat, buttoned neatly at the collar, but her breathing was labored. Her hair was shorter now, her face thinner, her skin pale. And yet, one look was enough. She was still beautiful in a way time could never touch. For a moment, every sound around him disappeared. She looked up, met his eyes, and for a brief second, her hazel gaze widened in disbelief. "Evan?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper. He nodded, taking a careful step forward. "I didn't mean to frighten you, but I needed to see you." She took half a step back, gripping the folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You have no right to be here." Evan stopped, his voice low and trembling. 9 years, Lila. I've been looking for you for 9 years. And that night, I heard the little girl sing our song. Her face paled. She turned away, her voice hoarse. "You shouldn't bring up the past." "I have to," he said, stepping closer, his tone growing urgent. "You called me a liar, but I never betrayed you. You disappeared without a word, and I didn't know how to live after that." Lila lifted her head, tears glimmering under the sterile white light of the hallway. "Don't act like you were innocent. Rebecca showed me everything. The photos, the messages, the transaction records. I saw it all." Evan shook his head, stunned. "Rebecca Mitchell? You mean my investor? She told me you used me, that I was just a distraction. I believed her, because I saw the proof." Her voice cracked, as if each word reopened an old wound. Evan stood silent for a moment, then spoke slowly. "I never had anything with Rebecca. What you saw, it might not have been real." Lila gave a small, broken laugh, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Not real? You think I couldn't tell? I was pregnant, Evan, and I left because I refused to let my child grow up in a lie." His heart seized. "Pregnant?" The word escaped before he could stop it. She froze, realizing what she had just revealed. Their eyes met, and something flickered in his mind. A sudden, blinding truth. "Sophie," he whispered. She turned away, avoiding his gaze, her voice trembling. "Don't, Evan. Don't make this harder. That little girl is my entire world now. Please, just leave us alone." Evan stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion. "I only need to know one thing. Sophie, is she my daughter?" Layla said nothing. She simply stood there, silent, as tears fell onto the folder in her hands. That silence was enough. He stepped back, his heart pounding wildly, as if his chest could no longer contain the surge of everything he'd buried for years. The pain that came wasn't anger. It was pure regret. Finally, he spoke softly. "I won't disturb you, but I'm not leaving again." She looked up, eyes glistening, lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Evan only nodded once, quietly, and turned away. He walked down the long corridor, past strangers who didn't know that his entire world had just shifted. Outside, the fog had lifted. Sunlight spilled across the hospital steps, cold but clear. He took a deep breath, then noticed the folder she had left on the waiting bench. On the corner of the first page, one line was printed clearly. Sophie Morgan, guardian, Lila Morgan. Evan closed his eyes. There was no doubt anymore. He had a daughter, and he had missed 9 years of her life. 2 days after the encounter at the hospital, Evan still couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lila's face blurred beneath the white hallway lights, and heard her trembling voice as she uttered the words, "I was pregnant." Everything he had believed for the past 9 years, that she had left because she no longer loved him, suddenly felt meaningless. Something else had happened. Another hand had destroyed everything. On Monday morning, Evan summoned his internal security team. He handed them the entire archive that Rebecca Mitchell had once held when she was still an investor at Aurora Sound. "I want every file rechecked," he said, his voice calm but his eyes burning. "Every email, every image, every recording she ever sent. I need to know how the truth was twisted." He worked for 3 days straight, barely leaving the office. The large screen in the conference room filled with folders, photos, and documents. When the analysis software finished processing the data, the air in the room turned to stone. Many of the photos Rebecca had sent Lila, the so-called proof of betrayal, were composites. The traces of editing were obvious. Worse still, the bank statements and transaction records she had provided were forged. A digital forensics expert pointed to the file codes. These were generated using an old financial editing program. She altered the data and printed it to make it look authentic. Evan sat frozen, his hand curling into a fist. Anger surged, then gave way to a deep, hollow ache. 8 years of love, 1 short letter, and 9 years of guilt, all born from a single lie. He lifted his head. "Do we have solid proof?" "Everything, sir," the assistant confirmed. "Original messages, unedited images, and her computer's log history. Rebecca accessed internal data without authorization." Evan exhaled slowly, then stood. "Prepare a press conference, but before we release anything, I need to see Lila." That afternoon, Lila sat in a small cafe near the hospital, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm ginger tea. Her face was still pale, but her eyes no longer looked afraid. When the door opened, Evan walked in. No suit jacket, no briefcase, no guards. Just a man trying to reclaim what he'd lost. He sat across from her. "I found everything," he said softly, yet with quiet certainty. "Rebecca lied to you. Everything you saw was fake." Lila stared at him in silence. The light from the window spilled across the tablecloth, catching the tear that trembled on her lashes. "Do you have proof?" Evan opened his tablet and placed it on the table. The screen displayed the original photos, the real financial records, and the technical analysis report. "It's all here. She used falsified software to tear us apart." Lila covered her mouth, a small sob escaping like a breath. "Oh God, I believed her. I left when I was pregnant." Evan looked at her, pain and tenderness mingling in his eyes. "I know, and I lost both of you that day." They sat facing each other in silence. Outside, a fine rain tapped softly against the glass. It was a long quiet, one not filled with resentment, but with the fragile return of memories once buried. Finally, Lila spoke. "I hurt you so much." "No," Evan murmured. "Rebecca did that. You were just trying to survive." She broke down, tears falling freely for the first time in years. Evan didn't reach out or interrupt. He simply sat there until her sobs faded into weary breaths. When she finally looked up, he spoke again, his voice gentle, almost like a promise. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I'll stay if you'll let me. For Sophie. For you. Lila glanced down, her fingers slowly turning the teacup. Sophie. She always asks about her father. Maybe it's time she knew the truth. A faint light flickered in Evan's eyes. He nodded slowly. Can I see her tomorrow? She nodded, a faint, trembling smile on her lips. Tomorrow. Outside, the San Francisco sky was clearing after days of gray. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over two people once torn apart by lies. And for the first time in 9 years, they sat together, not in the past, but in a place where hope was quietly beginning again. The next morning, San Francisco's sky was crystal clear after a night of rain. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly baked bread from a small shop down the street. Lila sat on a wooden bench in Dolores Park, a thin scarf draped loosely over her shoulders. Beside her, Sophie was drawing with an old box of crayons, her lips quietly humming a familiar tune. Lila watched her for a moment, then said softly, Sophie, today I want you to meet someone. Someone you've often asked about. The little girl looked up, her eyes bright with curiosity. Who is it, Mom? Lila only smiled. You'll see soon. From a distance, Evan stood watching them, a bouquet of sunflowers in his hand. His heart pounded as if he were stepping onto a stage for the first time. 9 years of silence, guilt, and longing, all condensed into this single moment, where one meeting could change everything. Lila raised her hand, signaling him to come closer. Sophie, come here, sweetheart. The girl set down her crayons and ran across the grass, her tiny canvas shoes leaving soft prints on the lawn. Evan knelt down so that his eyes met hers. Hello, Sophie, he said gently, his voice warm and steady. Hi, mister, she replied, her gaze curious. Mom said someone wanted to meet me. Was that you? Yes, Evan smiled faintly. It was me. She tilted her head. You know my name? Of course, he said. I've heard you sing. Really? Where? At the talent show. You sang with all your heart, Sophie. The girl smiled proudly. I sang for Mom. Her heart gets tired sometimes, so I just wanted to make her happy. Evan's eyes glistened as he looked over at Lila. You did more than that, he said softly. Your voice was beautiful. A quiet moment passed between them, tender and fragile. Lila came closer and sat down beside her daughter, her hands trembling slightly. Sophie, there's something I want to tell you. What is it, Mom? Lila took a deep breath. Do you remember when you asked me why other kids have their dads take them to school, but you don't? Sophie nodded. Today I want you to know, Mr. Evan isn't just Mommy's friend. He's your father. The little girl froze. That one sentence seemed to still the world around her. Evan stayed kneeling, afraid to even breathe. 1 second passed, then 2, before Sophie whispered, Really? He nodded, his voice breaking. Yes, I'm sorry I came so late. Her eyes fluttered, then lifted into a trembling smile. Then, can I call you Dad? A breath of laughter escaped him, thick with emotion. If you want to, I'd be the happiest man in the world. Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck. I've wished for a dad for so long, and now I have one. Evan held her tightly, that small, warm weight against his chest filling every empty corner of the years he had lost. Lila watched, tears streaming down her cheeks. But this time, they were tears of release, not pain. Evan looked up at her over their daughter's shoulder. I'm sorry for missing both of you. Lila shook her head gently. No one's to blame, Evan. Life just took us on a long detour. The three of them sat together on the bench. Sophie chattered about her school, her music teacher, and the neighbor's cat named Muffin. Evan listened, smiling without pause. Every giggle, every word, felt like a piece of his life, finally falling back into place. When the sun climbed higher, Sophie tilted her head and asked, "Dad, Mom says her heart is weak. Can you make her better?" Evan brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his voice low but full of promise. "I'll do everything I can, sweetheart. I promise." The afternoon drifted by in golden light and laughter. As they said goodbye, Sophie wrapped her arms around both of them, whispering, "We're a family now, right?" "Yes, darling," Lila said, pressing her cheek against her daughter's hair. Evan drew them both into his arms. "And this time," he said softly, "I'll never lose this family again." The late sunlight spread across the park, turning the grass and their faces to gold. In the middle of a bustling city, among strangers and memories long lost, a family had found its way back together, through faith, through forgiveness, and through a love that had never truly faded. A week after that morning in the park, life for the three of them seemed to have finally settled into a rare calm. Every evening after work, Evan stopped by the bakery, buying a few of Sophie's favorite cupcakes before the three of them strolled along the harbor to watch the sunset. Lila had begun to smile again, and Sophie never went anywhere without her sketchbook, now filled with drawings of Mom, Dad, and Muffin the cat. But just as light had started to bloom, shadows from the past began to stir once more. One morning, Evan arrived at Aurora Sound to find the conference room packed with reporters. On the large screen hanging in the lobby, bold headlines flashed one after another. Aurora CEO secretly funding his ex-lover with a heart condition, scandal or sympathy? Photos of him carrying Sophie in the park had spread across social media, followed by a flood of cruel comments. A familiar voice came from behind him. "The news travels faster than I expected, Evan." Rebecca Mitchell stood there in a sleek black dress, her half-smile cold and poisonous. "You did this?" Evan asked, his fists tightening. She shrugged lightly. "Don't blame me. You ignored me, then ran back to the woman who ruined your life. The world deserves to know who you really are." He let out a dry laugh. "Who I really am. I'm the fool who once trusted you. And now I finally understand why Lila disappeared 9 years ago." The smile on her lips faltered. "You have no proof." "Oh, I do," Evan replied, his tone sharp as glass. "I just haven't made it public yet. But if you take one more wrong step, everything will be released." Rebecca hesitated for a heartbeat, then regained her composure. "You really think you can protect them forever? The media doesn't care about truth, Evan. They only care about a story." She turned and walked away, leaving behind the heavy scent of her perfume, like the toxic echo of a past that refused to die. For 2 days, Evan's phone never stopped vibrating. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings. Partners hesitated. Some even suggested he step down temporarily. But there was only one thing he truly feared: that if Lila found out, she would disappear again. And he couldn't survive losing her a second time. That evening, when he arrived at the bakery, the lights were already off. Lila sat inside, her head buried in her hands. On the table beside her lay a phone, the screen open to one of the online tabloids. "You saw it?" Evan asked quietly. She nodded, eyes red. "They're calling me a homewrecker, a secret from your past. Evan, if this hurts your company, I'll leave." He stepped forward and took her hands. "No, you're not going anywhere. Not this time. I'll face this myself. I won't let anyone hurt you again." The next day, Aurora Sound issued an official statement. Evan appeared before the press, speaking calmly but firmly. "The woman in those photos is not a scandal. She's the mother of my child. Years ago, she was the victim of lies that destroyed lives. I won't let that happen again. The room fell into stunned silence. Then he presented the evidence. Every falsified document, every manipulated photo, every recording that proved Rebecca's deceit. The final blow was an audio clip. Rebecca's voice threatening him in his office. Within 24 hours, every headline changed. Police opened an investigation. Rebecca was arrested for data theft and defamation. Aurora's partners returned, and the company's stock soared to its highest point in years. But for Evan, the real victory wasn't reputation or revenue. It was the moment he came home that evening and saw Lila on the sofa, eyes still swollen, but a faint smile on her lips. Sophie ran to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "See, I told you, Daddy. You're a good guy." Evan lifted her up, looking toward the window where the golden light of sunset spilled into the room. Outside, the city roared as always, restless and alive. But inside that small apartment, everything had finally found its own quiet rhythm. He turned to Lila and said softly, "The storm's passed. Now it's time to start healing." Lila rested her head on his shoulder, her voice barely more than a breath. "As long as we're together, Evan, I believe no storm can ever break us again." In the days following the media storm, their lives slowly returned to a gentle rhythm. Lila left her job at the bakery, following her doctor's advice to rest. Evan arranged a corner of the top floor of Aurora's headquarters just for her, a sunlit room with a wide window overlooking the bay and a small piano placed right by the glass. Each morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped in, Lila would sit there, pressing the keys softly, teaching her heart to grow accustomed again to a calmer beat. The doctor said her heart condition had stabilized, but would require regular monitoring. Evan didn't miss a single appointment. He went with her to the hospital every time, listening carefully to the doctor's instructions, asking detailed questions about her medication and diet. As if this were a contract, he refused to let any detail go wrong. Every time they left the hospital, he would squeeze her hand gently and whisper, "Your heart's been through enough. Now it's my turn to take care of it." In the afternoons, Sophie would come home from school and run down the bright hallways, singing little melodies without words. Sometimes she'd pull her mother to the piano, laughing, "Mom, let's make a song. I'll write the sunshine, and you write the wind." Lila would laugh softly, her eyes glowing again. From those playful sessions, a new melody began to take shape. Evan recorded it using Aurora's studio equipment, added soft guitar chords, and titled it New Beginning. That song soon became the heartbeat of their small world. In the evenings, they'd sit together, listening to it play, each note a reminder that life was still pulsing forward, even through the scars on Lila's heart. Evan was no longer the distant, calculating CEO he had once been. He laughed more, spoke more, learned to bake, learned to braid Sophie's hair, and learned to listen when Lila grew tired. And she, after so many years of carrying everything alone, finally knew what it felt like to lean on someone without fear of losing them. One late night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Lila sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker like fallen stars. Evan brought over 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of her. "I think you're ready to write again," he said. She looked at him, puzzled. "Write what?" "The ending to our old song," he replied with a quiet smile. "You are my home. It never really ended." She fell silent for a moment, then placed her hands on the piano. The first note drifted out, fragile but warm. Evan sat beside her, lightly touching her shoulder before joining in on guitar. Together they sang, his voice rough, hers soft, merging like 2 streams meeting again after years apart. When the last line came, Lila turned to him, her lips trembling. "I was afraid my heart wouldn't survive another break." Evan leaned closer, his voice tender. Then let me hold it until it forgets how to be afraid. She's rested her head on his shoulder, eyes closed, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time in years, she wasn't counting her own. A month later, they returned for her follow-up appointment. The doctor smiled and said her heart had improved significantly. "There's no miracle here," he said. "She's just finally being loved the right way." The words made them both laugh softly. That evening, as they left the hospital, they took Sophie to the beach. The little girl ran along the sand, shouting into the wind, holding a heart-shaped kite that fluttered above her. Evan watched them, his hand finding Lila's. "See," he said quietly, "the wind still blows the same way, but everything feels different now." "Because we're walking together," she replied, smiling. Above them, the kite soared higher, spinning against the golden sky. Below, the three of them stood side by side, watching as the waves washed away the last traces of their pain. And somewhere between the sea breeze and the fading sun, that old melody rose again, gentle and certain. A vow made whole at last. "You are my home." A year had passed since the storm had swept through their lives. San Francisco was stepping into summer, its morning fog no longer heavy, the sunlight scattering across the bay like 1,000 shards of glass. Life for Lila, Evan, and Sophie had grown so peaceful that it almost seemed as if no turmoil had ever existed. Lila was healthier now, her voice clearer, deeper, and more assured. Every morning, she and Sophie practiced singing together while Evan brewed coffee, leaning against the window frame, watching the two people he loved most. That quiet sense of peace made the noise of the outside world feel distant and irrelevant. One afternoon, Lila received an invitation to perform at the Bay Area Charity Gala, a fundraising concert for children with heart conditions. She hesitated for a moment, unsure, but Sophie's voice broke in, bright and determined. "You have to sing, Mom? You said music makes hearts stronger." Evan placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "You don't have to be strong like before, Lila, but if you want to sing, Sophie and I will be there, right in the front row." Lila smiled softly. "Then this time," she said, "we'll sing together." The night of the gala arrived. The grand theater by the bay glowed under hundreds of spotlights. When Lila stepped onto the stage, microphone trembling slightly in her hand, the entire hall fell into silence. Evan and Sophie sat in the first row. He wasn't wearing a suit tonight, just a simple shirt, choosing to blend in rather than stand apart. Sophie waved when her mother looked down, her pure smile dissolving all of Lila's fear. She took a deep breath, and the first notes of New Beginning filled the hall. Her voice was warm and steady, every word carrying gratitude, not just to life, but to the love that had brought her back to it. At the chorus, the sound of a piano rose from backstage. Evan appeared, sitting at the instrument, his hands firm on the keys. The audience gasped, then erupted into applause. Lila turned to him, smiling through tears, and continued singing. Sophie stepped between them, her small voice rising, clear and bright. "Through every storm, every tear, we found our way to the light." The line drew quiet tears from many in the audience. No one needed to know the story behind it. They could feel that love itself was the cure. When the song ended, the hall stood as one. Applause thundered. Lila bowed, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, but her smile remained. Evan stood, walked to the stage, and held out a small ring. Then, under the glow of the stage lights, he knelt before her. "9 years ago, I lost my way home," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "But you and Sophie brought me back. Lila, will you be my home forever?" The entire theater went silent. Lila lifted her hand to her lips, eyes shining, and nodded. "Yes, Evan, I will." The applause surged again, mingling with soft music as Sophie wrapped her arms around them both, laughing. "See? I told you my song would bring good luck." The next morning, photos from the gala appeared on every major newspaper. But this time, they weren't headlines of scandal or gossip. They were images of a small family holding hands on stage beneath glowing letters that read, "New Beginning, the Song of Hope." That evening, when they returned home, Sophie brought out an old music box she had found long ago in a thrift store. "Mom, it still only plays 3 notes," she said, a little disappointed. Evan took it carefully, wound the spring, and the box began to play. This time, the full melody of "You Are My Home." Lila looked up, eyes glistening. "When did you fix it?" He smiled. "While you were learning to believe in miracles again." Lila rested her head on his shoulder, Sophie curling into her mother's arms. The 3 of them sat quietly, listening to the tiny notes chiming through the warm air. Outside, the first light of dawn spilled through the window, flooding the room in gold. For them, this sunrise was more than the start of a new day. It was the next chapter of a song still being written, one composed of love, forgiveness, and faith reborn. 3 months after the gala night, Evan and Lila's wedding took place in a small garden overlooking the Sausalito Bay. The sky was a deep, perfect blue. The breeze carried the scent of sea salt and lavender from the flower beds lining the path. There were no reporters, no noise, just a quiet ceremony with a few close friends and several children from their charity foundation. Everyone wore white. Sophie ran in circles around the garden, her lace dress fluttering, a basket of sunflowers in her hands as she scattered petals down the aisle. Lila appeared at the far end of the garden, her cream wedding gown flowing gently with each step. She was radiant, though still a little thin, her beauty softened by grace and strength. She walked slowly between the rows of chairs, eyes never leaving the man waiting ahead. Evan stood in a pale gray suit, not lavish, but his gaze held everything she had ever dreamed of. When she reached him, he extended his hand. "Are you all right?" Lila smiled warmly. "This time, my heart's racing only because it's happy." The ceremony was simple yet deeply moving. When the officiant asked, "Do you promise to hold each other's hand for the rest of your lives?" Lila looked at him, her eyes shimmering. "I do." Evan answered immediately, his voice trembling. "I already said I do 9 years ago." Applause rippled through the guests. Sophie cheered, running to hug them both. "See? I told you. Love songs never lie." That evening, at the small outdoor reception, Evan made an announcement that he and Lila had been quietly preparing for weeks. "From today," he said, raising his glass, "the Sophie Hart Foundation is officially established. Its mission is to support children and families suffering from heart disease." Applause burst out again, and Sophie looked up at her parents, glowing with pride. Lila took the microphone, her voice gentle and clear. "There was a time I thought my heart was too weak to ever love again. But love, when it's nurtured by kindness, can be stronger than any illness. And today I know I'm living with the strength of 3 hearts." As the sun began to set over the bay, Evan and Lila sang "You Are My Home," the song that had once brought them back together after years apart. Sophie sat at the piano, her tiny fingers gliding across the keys, filling the air with a pure, tender melody. The guests fell silent. Only their voices and the sound of the waves remained. At the final line, Evan held his wife's hand and sang softly, "You are my home, my forever home." When night fell, paper lanterns illuminated the garden in warm, golden light. Sophie lay in her mother's arms, eyes half closed. "Daddy," she murmured, "if I write a new song, I'll call it Our Home." Evan brushed her hair gently. "I think that might be the best song in the world." Lila looked at them both, resting her head on Evan's shoulder. "You know, I Used to be afraid of happiness, afraid it would slip away like everything else. But not anymore. Evan squeezed her hand, smiling. Because this happiness isn't something we found, Lila. It's something we built. In the distance, the children from their foundation laughed and released small wind lanterns into the sky. Their light shimmered on the water below, like thousands of smiling stars. In the middle of the glowing garden, the small family sat close together, listening to the waves and to the faint music drifting from the old music box by the window. You are my home. You are my home. And for the first time, after 9 long years of being lost, they had truly come home. Not to a house of wood or brick, but to a home built of love, forgiveness, and 3 hearts finally beating in unison. Some encounters may seem like coincidence, yet they're powerful enough to change an entire life. For Evan, Lila, and Sophie, miracles didn't come from magic. They came from people who dared to love once more, who found the courage to forgive, and who believed that a heart, even when broken, can still beat again when held in the right hands. Their story isn't just about rediscovering love. It's about finding the true meaning of home, a place not measured by walls or an address, but by the people we're willing to wait for, to protect, and to love even after everything has fallen apart. If you've ever lived through days when starting over felt impossible, remember, somewhere out there, someone still believes in you, just as Evan believed in Lila, and Sophie believed in them both. Because sometimes it only takes a single glance, a song, or an embrace to help the heart find its way back. You are my home. It isn't just their melody. It's a gentle reminder to us all that no matter how many turns life takes, we can always find our way home, to the place where love never dies.